Welcome to Downtown Sports. My name is Downtown Stephen Brown. This is just kind of weird. I'm just gonna put the hat back on, and I guess this is kind of part 3 of the series of videos where I kind of just sat down and just talked to the camera a lot over the last couple of days. But in this video, we're gonna be asking the question, and we're gonna go over it fairly. Don't worry. Can Kyle Dubas build a hockey team? But before we start to answer that question, I think that we need to be a little bit more specific here. Because as far as building hockey teams goes, I mean, the guy does have a Calder Cup to his name. So I guess then the question becomes, can Kyle Dubas build an NHL team, and can he build it in the salary cap era? Well, in order to do that, we need to take a look at the roster right now. So ignoring the salary cap, this is a very talented offensive team that Kyle Dubas has put together, but the problem has always been the defense and the goaltending this season. But let's talk about, because the only way that we can really talk about Kyle Dubas is to compare him to his predecessor. We need to kind of go back in time and take a look at the context here to flesh things out and see if we can tangibly tie things to him and say, yes, this was 100% your fault, or you made this worse. So in order to do that, we're going to take a look at the Toronto Maple Leafs' defense and how it's progressed over the years, starting in the 16-17 season. I don't really think it's fair to look at the 15-16 season because they were trying to lose on purpose, and that's not a true reflection of anyone's job. So more or less by the number of games that they played in the 16-17 season, this was the Toronto Maple Leafs' D-core. Now, just as a thing that I want to get out there, Roman Polak, Matt Hunwick, and later Ron Hainsey, I don't necessarily think that they were bad defensemen. I think that they were defensemen just asked to play roles that they probably shouldn't have. The 17-18 season rolls around, and really the only difference here is Ron Hainsey. And again, this year, the Toronto Maple Leafs take on the Boston Bruins and lose in Game 7. Now, in the Game 7 lineup, Travis Dermott did play a couple of games towards the end of the year, but he did not play in that Game 7 of that series. Andreas Borgman was another guy that got into about 40 games or so, but he didn't play that large of a role. And again, the final verdict was that the defense sucked. The 2018-19 season, the Toronto Maple Leafs are looking to make the playoffs for their 3rd straight season. They're again an offensive powerhouse, but the defense, again, kinda sucked still. But Kyle Dubas went out and acquired a guy like Jake Muzzin, who was thought to be at the time the big fish defenseman that was available. It was a clear acquisition that said that, hey, we want to make this defense better. And just to interrupt here before I get to this season, I'm not saying that in years previous to the 18-19 season that the Toronto Maple Leafs needed to go out there and get a defenseman like Jake Muzzin to pay the price that they did for Jake Muzzin. But in going through this year to year, the point of it is I'm looking for marginal upgrades to the defense. And if the defense sucked in the 16-17 season, and it sucked again in the 17-18 season, and there were no moves made to even marginally upgrade that defense, then that's literally the definition of insanity. So going back to comparing the defense, I guess, here, again, in the 18-19 season, the verdict was that it wasn't good enough. And I can say that looking at this decor, it just wasn't good enough. Now, this season, Morgan Rielly, Tyson Barrie, Jake Muzzin, Justin Holl, Rasmus Sandin, and Travis Dermott is probably the best 6 defensemen that the Toronto Maple Leafs have to offer right now. And the verdict still is that they suck. And let's just make something really, really clear about Tyson Barrie. Because anyone who tries to tell you that he's just straight up literal garbage is wrong. The reason why he was brought in here was to be an offensive defenseman. He was supposed to subset the loss of Jake Gardiner. And since the coaching change, all Tyson Barrie has done is produce at a 56-point pace over the entire course of the season, so I don't really know what more you expected from Tyson Barrie. Tyson Barrie on his own is not the problem here. Maybe as a whole, when you look at the whole group, yes, it's a problem, but him individually, no, he's doing what he was asked to do. And this is where things start to get a little bit dicey because Cody Cece's only a Toronto Maple Leaf because Nikita Zaitsev was signed to $4.5 million for the rest of time. If this contract isn't signed, Cody Cece's not a Toronto Maple Leaf. And don't go starting a referendum on me over the damn thing. I mean, what do you want Kyle Dubas to say? Yeah, the guy sucks and we don't want him on our hockey team. Yeah, great way to talk about an asset. And let's say the trade never happened. You'd have Nikita Zaitsev on the team for another 4 years after this one, making $4.5 million. Yeah, you'd still have Connor Brown, but would you rather have Cody Ceci, not Connor Brown, and just dust your hands with the entire cap hit altogether? There's going to be more Connor Browns in the years to come. Pierre Engvall's done a great job as a call-up from the Toronto Marlies. The one thing that you can't get back is the cap space in the next 4 seasons. The verdict right now is that this D-core built by Kyle Dubas in the 1920 season sucks. But the 1920 season is not over, so we're going to put a pin in it for now, and we're going to come back to it in a later video. Now, Patrick Marleau was a big acquisition that was made by Lou Lamoriello in the summer of 2017, and the 3rd year of that contract always looked really bad. But to give the general manager a break, I don't think that they also expected Austin Matthews, William Nylander, and Mitch Marner to command as much money as they eventually did, and don't worry, we're gonna get to that. So I'm going to give Lou a little bit of a break on this one because I also don't think they expected it to cost a 1st round pick to move the contract in that 3rd year if they really needed to, and also because Patrick Marleau had some pretty decent seasons in Toronto, including a 27-goal year in the 1st year of the contract and being a healthy contributor in that first Boston series. Probably Lou Lamoriello's greatest success in Toronto, aside from acquiring Frederik Andersen, is negotiating the contracts that Morgan Rielly and Nazem Kadri are currently on. And this is going to be a talking point later on in the video when we discuss Matthews, Marner, and Nylander. So kudos to Lou for that because the Toronto Maple Leafs in some sort of way are still benefiting from both of those contracts. But again, that's not to say that it makes up for the contracts that he signed Patrick Marleau and Nikita Zaitsev for. Now, I don't think Kyle Dubas is a great negotiator. I actually think he's kind of a poor negotiator. But when you take a look at the New York Islanders cap situation and some of the deals that Lou Lamoriello has negotiated, like Anders Lee and Brock Nelson, I don't think that he's this master negotiator that a lot of people have propped him up to be. And the John Tavares sweepstakes do play a part in this conversation because it's very rare where a successor steals away a star player from their predecessor and their mentor. And the New York Islanders, of course, had a lot of variables working against them, but I want to point something else out. Lou Lamoriello was the general manager of the New Jersey Devils for longer than most of us have been alive. But he was also the general manager when the Devils lost Zach Parise to the Minnesota Wild in free agency. Now, of course, there's probably a lot of variables that went into that contract negotiation as well, but if you want to nickel and dime Kyle Dubas for everything, let's not pretend like this guy's perfect either. Now, draft records of individual teams are very subjective because you have a lot of scouts sitting at the table and you don't really know who's advocating for each player. And the draft that I want to direct everyone's attention to is the 2015 draft. Now, heading into this draft, the Maple Leafs did not have a general manager. It was kind of just Brendan Shanahan, Kyle Dubas, and Mark Hunter. And it's well noted that both Mark Hunter and Kyle Dubas were very active at the table and played a large role in Mitch Marner and Travis Dermott both being drafted. Mark Hunter obviously having the connection to the London Knights and Mitch Marner playing for London, he was obviously a player that he advocated for. But knowing what we know about Kyle Dubas and him loving smaller scaled wingers, I can't imagine him advocating for the Leafs to take any other player but Marner. And if you remember the 2016 draft, it was a little bit strange because the philosophy just changed like that. Lou Lamoriello was in charge for this one, and they went from drafting smaller skilled players in the 2015 draft to drafting almost exclusively bigger players. And there's nothing wrong with that. You need size in the NHL, and that's something that the Toronto Maple Leafs are lacking, and they're hurting because of it. But a lot of these guys are just not even with the organization anymore. They were just straight up non-tendered. And then in the 2017 draft, there's not a whole lot there besides Timothy Liljegren and Ian Scott, who won Goaltender of the Year in the CHL. But then in the 2018 draft, you're going to see guys like Rasmus Sandin, Sean Durzi, who was used in the Jake Muzzin trade, Semyon Darginstev, who's lighting the OHL on fire, along with Nick Robertson, who's another Leafs draft pick, Mac Hollowell, who guys are high on, Philip Krall, who's having a decent year in the WHL, and then the most recent draft, 2019. What do you really have to say about Nick Robertson other than holy shit? Because like I showed in a couple of videos ago, Nick Robertson holds the 7th highest goals per game in a single season with at least 20 goals scored in OHL history, with 46 goals in 40 games right now. And the best part about it is his age. He missed being eligible for this year's entry draft by just 4 days, and you better believe that a guy with 46 goals in 40 games is going a lot higher than 53rd. Mark Hunter was a name that was tossed around as being a legitimate candidate for the job when Lou Lamoriello left. But Kyle Dubas at this point had been with the Toronto Maple Leafs for 4 years. They plucked him out of Sault Ste. Marie purposely for this role, and they gave him Lou Lamoriello as a mentor to purposely groom him for the role of being the general manager of the Toronto Maple Leafs. And I mean, Mark Hunter has his ties to London, and I don't really want to speak too much about his situation, but in the jobs that he has interviewed for, nobody's decided to hire him, and I believe family played a factor in that. He wanted to be close to London, where his family is. But we're seeing the Toronto Maple Leafs continue to draft guys like Nick Robertson and Rasmus Sandin without Mark Hunter and Lou Lamoriello, so maybe we can give a little bit more credit to guys like Kyle Dubas. And I just want to make it clear, again, not a knock on Mark Hunter at all. He's gone on to have success with Hockey Canada and the World Juniors. With his brother, he's where he wants to be. Scouting might be what Kyle Dubas is best at, but some may argue that he's only good at scouting certain types of talent and not others. But we're going to get into that a little bit later in the video. But if we take a look at the Toronto Maple Leafs' roster, his fingerprints are all over this team. And again, if we go back to this roster that I showed at the very beginning of the video, Lou Lamoriello gave up 2 second-round picks to acquire Thomas Plekanec and Brian Boyle as the solutions for the fourth line. Dubas went out there, got Jason Spezza, and then got a coach that was going to use Jason Spezza in the role that he intended him to. And I promised that we would talk about the big three here because we need to talk about them. Because if Kyle Dubas was able to get them to take even 5% less each, that adds up to over $1 million in the scope of the salary cap. 10% less? Almost $3 million. So it does matter. But if you're going to use that as a knock against Kyle Dubas, you also have to talk about the players that he's acquired to help round out this roster that are very, very cheap. Guys like Jason Spezza, Ilya Mikheyev, Justin Holl, Trevor Moore, drafting guys like Rasmus Sandin and Nick Robertson. It all goes hand in hand. And I mean, ideally, yeah, you would have liked him to have done both. Look, and I understand a lot of stuff happened over the last 2 years. Okay, first off, you got us John Tavares, and that was great, and then you got us Jake Muzzin, but then the coach kind of complained about it, and then you got eliminated by Boston, then you got eliminated by Boston again, and then you kind of got hosed in negotiations with Matthews, Marner, and Nylander, and then you had to deal with the whole Nikita Zaitsev and the Patrick Marleau third year of his deal, and he gave up a first-round pick to get rid of him, and a lot of people weren't too happy about that, but then you dealt fan favorite Nazem Kadri to the Colorado Avalanche for Tyson Barrie, and a lot of people are having a lot of problems seeing that trade in a positive light, but I can still see a smidge of positivity there, somehow, I don't know, and then you had to deal with the whole Mike Babcock thing to start the season, but then you fired him because he was playing Michael Hutchinson on the back-to-back situations against Boston for some reason on Saturday nights, and Leaf fans still have trauma about that. But then you went out there and you got a Sheldon Keefe. Sheldon Keefe was great, but then the backup situation started imploding on us. We had all the injuries, and then you went out there and you got a Jack Campbell, and that wasn't like Lou Lamoriello trading for Brian Boyle or Thomas Plekanec, just feeding second-round picks into the empty voids and stuff like that, because Jack Campbell's going to be here for another 2 seasons. He's looked kind of okay so far, but Kyle, you got to go out there and you got to get us another damn defenseman. Only a fool like myself would say that this team can make the playoffs and win a round. Okay, that's a long shot bet, but the verdict on this season is not out yet, and there's still time to make a trade. So Kyle, please get us that defenseman. And I don't necessarily agree with this philosophy or not, but the idea is that in a salary cap world, it's really hard to build a team that's both good at offense and good at defense. So you pick one and you really try to hammer that home. And with the Leafs, they've really tried to have an elite offense. And in cases where teams are good at both, there are other variables contributing to it. Like the Tampa Bay Lightning, for some reason, got guys to take discounts, but even they got bounced by Columbus in round 1 last year, so it's not foolproof. And with the Boston Bruins, they've been able to stay relevant over the years by getting guys like David Pastrnak, Brad Marchand, and Patrice Bergeron to sign the contracts that they did. But don't mistake it for them being exemplary examples of what it means to be a team player or not. Knowing what we know now, those players would not sign those contracts over again. What would they get on the open market? $10 million each, $11 million each. I mean, come on. They're literally nicknamed the perfection line. But to answer the question that I first proposed at the beginning of the video, can Kyle Dubas build an NHL team in the salary cap era? I don't know. I can't really give you an answer to that because there's still another week or so until the trade deadline. And even that passes, I can't really say yes or no if he does get a defenseman or not, because anything can happen in the playoffs, right? I mean, Columbus beat Tampa Bay last year. St. Louis won the Cup after being in last place, and I understand you don't want to have to rely on a Hail Mary situation. You'd feel more comfortable if he went out there and got a defenseman. But I mean, even years ago, the LA Kings went into the playoffs in the 2012 season as the 8th seed in the West, and they won the Stanley Cup. You got to get in there, and it's a crapshoot. Anything can happen. But knowing Leaf fans, even if this team does magically somehow end up winning the Stanley Cup, whether they add a defenseman or not this season, people will find a way to pick at it, right? They'll say that the way that they won was wrong, or they won't be able to repeat, like that'll never happen, or they'll never win another one. Do I think the Dubas should be fired at the end of this season if they don't make the playoffs or if they get bounced in round one? No, I think that would be a mistake, but I can understand how people would be frustrated with it. But like what I just said, Leaf fans will find a way to pick at anything. So I don't even know if this video or anything that I said really matters in the scope of things. So if you did like the video, make sure to leave a like on this one. It took a while to film and research and stuff like that. And subscribe for more because more is always on the way. And guys, the Toronto Maple Leafs are gonna make the playoffs, and I'm gonna say it with blind optimism because I'm a fool. They're gonna win a round this year.